Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be talking about the news that's just broken a couple of hours ago as Europe is waking up, as North America's about to wake up, and as I finish work for the day. And that is, of course, that Jack Doohan has officially been sacked by Alpine. So taking a look at the official press release on the F1 website, it says Alpine confirmed Colapinto to replace Doohan for next 5 rounds as team opt to rotate seat. So I don't know if the rotate seat part is some kind of spin that they're trying to put on this, saying, maybe if, things aren't so good with Colapinto, maybe we'll put Doohan back in the seat. Maybe it's to try to get more money from Colapinto sponsors. Maybe it's to open the door for potentially Paul Aaron getting the seat after those 5 races are up. Who really knows with this team, to be honest? And this, of course, coincides with the news as well that team principal Oliver Oakes, who I think a lot of us kind of knew was a puppet team principal, has basically resigned over Flavio Briatore's basically handling of this situation, basically opting to fire Doohan so early in the season. So let's take a look at each of those 6 races that Doohan did this year. So round 1 in Australia, qualifies 14th, a gap of 0.751 seconds to Gasly, a little bit bigger than you would have liked. And then, of course, in the race, wet race, pretty tricky conditions, crashes on the opening lap, basically spins on the straight between turns 5, turn 6. I think maybe put a wheel on the white paint and went into the wall, and that was it. His teammate Gasly finished 11th. Could have finished in the points if he didn't spin in the closing laps, but pretty terrible home Grand Prix for doing all things considered. Then we move on to race 2, which was China, and of course it was a sprint weekend. Now, sprint weekend, sprint qualifying, he actually out-qualifies Gasly. Out-qualifies him by 65 hundredths of a second, and in that sprint, finishes dead last, whereas his teammate finishes 12th. Picked up a 10-second penalty for spinning Bortoletto around, as pictured in the slide. Bit of a sloppy move there, and ultimately finishes 20.56 seconds behind his teammate, not even taking into account the penalty for the spin. So that means that he was basically a second a lap slower in the sprint. Main qualifying session, qualifies 18th, a second off Gasly. So honestly, qualifying in China, not so bad, to be honest, especially given it was a sprint and it was his second weekend of the season, 3rd of his career. Now in the race, finishes 13th. Gasly gets disqualified for technical infringement, and even if Gasly hadn't been disqualified, he would have only been 11.2 seconds behind him. Unfortunately, picks up another 10-second penalty, this time for forcing fellow rookie Isaac Hadjar off track. So again, two racing sessions, 2 10-second penalties, a little bit sloppy. Hasn't really had a clean weekend, but comparing himself to Gasly, didn't finish too far behind track this time out. Now, we get to Japan, and Alpine for Japan basically decided to give Jack Doohan's seat in FP1 to Ryo Hirakawa, who was at the time one of their 1,200 reserve drivers. Of course, Hirakawa has now moved on to be reserve driver for Haas, but basically that's kind of a marketing stint, Japanese driver, Japanese Grand Prix. They basically give Doohan's seat to Hirakawa for FP1. Opening laps of FP2, Doohan decides that he's going to take turn 1 flat out with DRS open, and of course the result is an extremely spectacular crash, as pictured. Lots and lots of damage. And Doohan basically going into Saturday with pretty much no running. Of course, this whole DRS gate debacle, and basically what Doohan said was he had basically been doing turn 1 in the simulator at the Alpine factory, basically with DRS open. And so he said, well, I did it in the simulator, so I thought I could do it in real life, despite the fact that it's generally pretty well known that you can't do turn 1 with DRS open. And again, Alpine kind of challenged those comments. Doohan felt like someone at the team should have told him about that if they were, looking at his data. And so I think you could kind of see things were generally, Alpine and Doohan were generally not seeing eye to eye. Nonetheless, a very track running limited weekend. Doohan qualifies 14th, but 0.691 seconds behind his teammate Gasly. Now in the race, not too terrible. Finishes 15th in a race where no one could really overtake because of track resurfacing, very narrow track, not a ton of great places to overtake. Whereas his teammate Gasly only 2 seconds in front, but he did finish 19.192 seconds off the road. So again, bit of a gap there to Gasly, a bit more than he would have wanted. Race, what are we on? Race 4, Bahrain. Qualifying 11th, 0.602 seconds to Gasly. I think this is one that kind of hurt. Gasly qualified 4th in this Grand Prix, Doohan knocked out in Q2. I think seeing that, I think this is one where Gasly or Doohan really wanted to take back, and he was really hoping to get into Q3. And this is also the track where preseason testing was. Doohan knows this track very well, unlike the first 3 he had gone to. And this was a track where Alpine, I think, in preseason testing, Alpine looked very strong, and we thought, they would be challenging Williams for best of the rest. And looking at 6 races worth of data, it seems like Bahrain is more of an outlier, and for whatever reason, they just seem to do very well at Bahrain and not particularly good anywhere else. So this, however, was, Doohan's big chance to score points for the first time in F1. Not a great race, I think. Alpine didn't give Doohan a particularly good strategy, but Doohan, his race pace, tire management has never really been seen at his strong suit in the junior categories, and it's definitely something I think was a big struggle through his 6th race stint this year. Finishes race 14th. Gasly finished 7th, ends up 16.8 seconds behind, but on top of that, got himself a 5-second penalty for track limit, so a little bit of a clumsy one there. So you can basically see 3 different incidents in the opening 4 races plus a sprint where Doohan's basically picked up a penalty of some kind during the race. Next up is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia qualifies 17th, not great again. Gap to Gasly 0.318 seconds. So again, a little bit of a gap there, but it is a bit smaller than the gap that you've seen at every race so far, with the exception of China. Now in the race, finishes 17th. The race pace was, to be frank, not very good. Direct comparison with his teammate Gasly is not possible, as of course Gasly crashed on the opening lap with his former teammate Tsunoda. But when you look at where Gasly qualified, the teams that were kind of expected to be around Alpine's pace, so the Williams, for example, and you compare that pace with Doohan, it was pretty shocking. Doohan ended up a lap down. He was racing with Stroll and Hulkenberg in the Sauber and the Aston, whereas the Williams that his car was expected to be around the same pace as were both in the point. So pretty shocking weekend, I think, overall in Saudi Arabia, and I think that's where I'm sure quite a few doubts started to creep in. But that being said, in the kind of 2-week gap between Saudi Arabia and Miami, Alpine basically came in and said, Doohan's our guy. He's going to be there until at least the summer break. And it seemed, a bit more positive and a bit more committal than things were kind of expected to be. As of course, before the season started, the expectation was, or what was widely reported, was that Doohan had a 5-race contract to start the season and no more. And basically, if he did well, he would get a couple more, he would get some more races. And if he didn't do so well, especially with Colapinto waiting in the wings since February, basically, he would be pushed aside. So of course, we get to Miami. So sprint qualifies 17th, out-qualified by Gasly by 0.826 seconds. However, that time is quite misleading, as Doohan was one of, I think, 5 drivers who missed a cutoff right at the end of Q1 to set their final flying laps. And so, that gap is not representative, I think, of the true gap between himself and Gasly in over 1 lap. Main qualifying session, actually, we'll go to the sprint. In the sprint, finishes 16th. Time gap between himself and Gasly, who finished 8th, picked up a point. Not super representative, as the race finished behind the safety car, but again, not spectacular there, and I think was one of the last classified finishers during that wet condition sprint. So not a great performance there. Main qualifying session, qualifies 14th, out-qualifies Gasly for the first time in a main qualifying session and second time overall, this time by a margin of 0.288 seconds. Now, based on the fact that Gasly basically opted to start from the pit lane, they changed a whole bunch of things. It was possible there was some kind of car issue there that contributed to Gasly getting knocked out. Again, I'm not going to say if that's definitively true or not. But again, from Doohan's perspective, it was a desperately needed positive out qualifying Gasly for the first time. But unfortunately, all that good work, putting himself in a position where, if he had a really strong race, if it was a bit chaotic, maybe he could score a point for the first time. But however, contact on the opening corner, this time with Liam Lawson, picked up a puncture and he was out of the race on the first lap, whereas his teammate Gasly, who started from the pit lane, came back and finished in 13, so made up quite a few positions in that race. So when you look at the season total, and just like as a summary of the season, six Grand Prix total, qualifying head-to-head 1 and 5 with a median qualifying gap to Gasly of 0.46 seconds. Quite big, but again, it is only the first quarter of the season and it is a pretty small sample size. If he had been allowed to stay on until the summer break, for example, I'm pretty sure that gap would have gone down to maybe 3/10, 2.5 I would say. Quality rating, this is a new stat, and again, I was going to talk about this in a video that's coming out, that was supposed to come out tomorrow. Because of this news, I'm going to postpone that for a couple more days, but basically I explain in further detail, but basically it compares drivers without using teammate data, and basically compares their data with historical data instead, using a best approximation of how strong a car is. So quality rating positive 0.361, which ranks 18th of the 20 drivers on the grid, so not great there. In terms of the races, points, he had none. Gasly picked up 7 over their time as teammates together, again not including Abu Dhabi last year. So again, I don't think this car was super strong these 6 races, and really the only race where I think you could realistically expect Doohan to score points was Bahrain. Now, in terms of expected points, looking at my expected points model, negative 0.98. So again, that means that he was expected to only score 1 point. Another way you could have looked at it, you can look at that number, is that there's a 98% chance he should have scored a point. So again, not a big difference there, and again, very small sample size. Race rating, so again, just like quality rating, a negative 0.654, which ranks 17th out of the 20 drivers. So pretty poor in both metrics there. And when you look at the teammate race model, comparing directly against his teammate Gasly in the race for race data, his score is a negative 3.128, which is pretty poor, and I believe that's the 15th or 14th worst score since 2008. I know that because I did a video on this last year. Again, very small sample size, and I'm sure if Doohan had seen out the whole season, I'm sure that's a number that would have improved. Now, I think overall my thoughts on this whole situation is, I think for Doohan, it's obviously really tough. And again, I do think it's quite harsh to fire him in only 6 races. Again, a lot of people 2 years ago were saying that firing De Vries after 10 races was pretty harsh. I think the difference is that De Vries was 28, about I think 6 years older than Doohan was this year, and he had a lot more professional experience. So I think the expectations were much higher on De Vries to be a much more finished product, a much more polished from the get-go, whereas I think with any rookie, I think there was an understanding that he would need time to bed in and improve. But it felt like, I think Alpine felt like they never really had a ton of confidence in him, even from basically, I would say, last fall all the way. I think there was kind of warning signs from last fall all the way through the winter before he even started, saying that based on their private testing data, that they were not particularly impressed with some of the times that he was putting in. They basically flew Gasly all the way to Qatar to basically do a direct test to see, how good or how bad he was actually doing, just because they couldn't really, they wanted kind of, proof that, what they were seeing in other tests was real or not. So I feel like for Gasly, or for Doohan, I should say, I feel like, Alpine never really had a lot of confidence in him, and that's an environment that for any driver is going to be really, really tough. But unfortunately for Doohan, I don't think he never really had any standout performances. Yes, he out-qualified Gasly once in a sprint, once in a Grand Prix, but in terms of race results, a lot of incidents, 2 first lap exits because of crashes, contact, a massive shunt in free practice, 3 different penalties I picked up in over 6 races and 2 sprints. So the race pace, I think, was a big question mark from me going into the season. And unfortunately, those question marks have not really been answered in the positive. So I think, again, really, really harsh on Doohan to be replacing with Colapinto. I do think Colapinto will likely be a bit of an upgrade. Maybe not one lap pace. I think one lap pace will probably be pretty close, but I think maybe a little bit better for Colapinto. But I do think race pace probably should be a bit better for the Argentinian. And again, that's something that we're going to have to wait and see. For Doohan, what does he do from here? I'm not entirely sure. I think what I heard is he's going to be a reserve driver for the rest of the season. And again, they say that they're going to rotate seats. So again, it doesn't mean that he, should something happen or should Colapinto fail to impress, it could leave the door open for him to somehow get back in that seat either this season or even next year. Should that not come to pass, maybe he goes off to do endurance racing in WEC. Maybe he goes off to Formula E. Maybe he goes off to IndyCar. I think those would kind of be the natural landing spots for him should another F1 team not be interested in his services. So there you go. That's the breaking news from today. Jack Doohan's basically been sacked by Alpine, replaced by Franco Colapinto with immediate effect for the next Grand Prix in Imola, which is in basically a week and a bit time. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back in a couple days with a video that I had originally planned for tomorrow. But again, if you watch that video and when I talk about doing there, I'm talking in the future tense with him being potentially fired. And that is, of course, because I recorded that video yesterday. So he hadn't actually been officially fired yet. So anyway, again, one final thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you again later. Goodbye.